the local authorities. There is, as I understand it, no mention of profit.
Second oral question, Lord Moylan.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, the Government's long-held view is that retrospectively altering imprisonment for public protection sentences would lead to an unacceptable risk to public safety. However, the Justice Select Committee of the other place has now published its report on the IPP sentence, and that report recommends bringing forward legislation to re-sentence all those offenders who continue to serve an IPP sentence. The Government will consider carefully all the recommendations in that report, including that one, and respond by the 28th of November.
My Lords, I thank my noble and learned friend for that answer. In addition to having resentencing at the core of its recommendations, the Justice Select Committee also draws attention to the fact that on MOJ figures, it is expected that as many as 2,600 IPP prisoners currently on licence in the community will be recalled over the next 4 years. On present experience, the majority of them without having committed a further offence. Does my noble and learned friend accept that these numbers will put an unacceptable strain on the prisoner's state, that everything should be done to avoid that situation eventuating, and that it's incumbent on His Majesty's Government to strengthen the probation service to ensure that it doesn't come about?
My Lords, first of all, may I make clear that the Government very much welcomes the Select Committee report, which is a powerful document and makes sober reading. On the question my noble Lord asks, the Government's view is that, first of all, public protection must come first. Secondly, it is not necessarily the case that these numbers of recalls will actually occur. But thirdly, and importantly, the Select Committee does discuss the need for further resources to the probation service to particularly supervise prisoners that are released on licence, and the Government will look very closely into further resources for the probation service in that regard.
My Lords, another day and another Justice Secretary bedevilling any coherence and continuity in policy. Would the noble Lord, learned Lord, agree with me that putting in place the expert panel suggested by the Justice Select Committee would be a first step, even if the Government don't accept resentencing, because it would allow them to look at the action plan and the important issue Lord Moreland has just raised in terms of those on licence who find themselves back in prison for the most trivial offence?
Well, Lords, the Government will, as I've just said, consider all the recommendations in the report. I would like to make clear that recall does not necessarily happen for trivial reasons. There are quite severe tests to be met for a recall. As far as the resentencing exercise is concerned and the panel itself is concerned, the Government will consider all the suggestions in the report, including those suggestions, and report back to the Justice Select Committee by the end of November.
My Lords, MPs and noble Lords from all parts of both houses have welcomed the excellent Neil report, and we're looking forward to the Government response with bated breath on the 28th of November. And I appreciate that the noble Lord the Minister might be unwilling to be drawn on the contents of the Government's response today, but will he at least agree with me that it's high time this terrible wrong done to these indeterminate sentence prisoners is righted?
The Government's view, as I've just said, is that despite the intractability of the problem, public protection must come first. And that is the position we have taken, the Government has taken over the years. Might I just, without at all prejudging the Government's position, say a word about the resentencing exercise, the suggested resentencing exercise. The only reason these offenders are detained is the parole board's decision that they are unsafe to be released. That is the situation with which we are faced. If we talk about resentencing in that context, most or many of the prisoners have already exceeded their original tariff. There's not going to be, perhaps, and I simply ask your lordships to reflect on this, to resentence for the actual offence may not be a particularly fruitful exercise because the tariff has already expired. So is it that what we are really considering is a reassessment of the risk to public safety? But that's an assessment that the parole board is already carrying out. So where does all that take one? I simply leave that question rhetorically for your lordships.
My Lords, it is certainly true that this is a difficult issue, and it is a difficult issue for the government to manage the risk of the IPP prisoners. In answer to the Noble Lord, Lord Moylan, the Noble and Learned Lord, the Minister, talked about extra resources for the probation service. I'd like to press him a little bit further on that. Does he accept that with the high recall rates of IPP prisoners out on licence, that there should be special training for probation officers who are dealing with these former prisoners who are out on licence to stop them either reoffending or breaking their licence conditions?
The Noble Lord, Lord Ponsonby, made a very similar and powerful point in the recent debate in relation to the probation services and the support that probation services can give these prisoners in the community, and the government will look very closely at that issue as all the issues raised in the report.
As it happens, I was confirming in Her Majesty's Prison Home House on Monday, and one of the people I confirmed was an IPP prisoner. And what we talked about was the desperate impact on family and on the children of the uncertainty that he has faced. And he has been recalled not having committed an offence, but broken. That it is very complicated. But in looking at this, will His Majesty's Government please look at the impact on children and family, and also the support not just from probation, but from other organisations like in the North East, NEPACS and Junction 42?
My Lords, the Government will, of course, consider those considerations along with all the others raised in the report.
My Lord, can I...
10 years ago, the IPP discredited scheme was abolished, alas, prospectively only. In the previous 7 years, 8,711 people had been sentenced to that regime, and almost all of them remain so. Almost exactly 1/3 of that number are in prison today. Half of that third because they've never yet been released, half because they've been recalled. The rest are under subject and threat of recall, are living a nightmare life. My question for the Minister is, how many of the 8,711 have finally managed to be discharged from this regime by having their licences discharged, by definition, 10 years or more after their initial release?
My Lords, I will provide the Noble Lord, the Noble and Learned Lord, with the figures very shortly, if I may. It's quite a complicated question, more complicated than it seems. I would simply remind the House that as a result of the new arrangements in the since 2022 in the Police Sentencing Crimes Act, there is now an automatic referral annually to the parole board for consideration for release by these prisoners. So the ability to terminate their licence is now baked into the system after the 10 years.
My Lords, can I welcome the Noble and Learned Minister's response today? I thought it was right and proper and considered. Particularly his emphasis on the primary purpose behind this, which is public protection. There are, I'm no doubt, many tragic cases of the people who have suffered from elongated imprisonment. On the other hand, there are many terrible cases of victims who have suffered as a result of it. On the question of the pressure on the estate, could he find a way of looking at why we are still sending people to prison for minor offences, including women for petty debts, because that was supposed to be the counterbalance to the introduction of IPP in the first place, but it's never actually been operationally implemented?
I thank the Noble Lord for his question. The government will look at all those aspects, and I would simply echo that in the debate the other day, if I've read the transcript correctly, the word victim hardly figured. And it is the government's duty to protect victims. We're dealing with very serious violence and sexual offences, and it's a very difficult question. Thank you.
Third oral question, Lord Oates.
My Lords, I